Hello everybody, this is Miranda the Hybrid and welcome to Tutorial Tuesday. Now today I have a kind of complicated tutorial to give you guys. It's on realism. Well, the basics of realism. You see, we could draw something extremely complicated today, or I could teach you just why something looks realistic. And so that's what I'm going to aim for. There are several things to think about when doing something realistic and why it looks realistic. One thing that newer artists tend to rely on are outlines. If you look at realistic pieces of art, there aren't any outlines. Lighting and accurate lighting, intensity, and color are also extremely important, as well as background. What is it sitting on? And the fun thing about background is that it'll actually let you go away from outlines in the first place and help you with your color balance and color shadows, because the background makes the foreground more relevant, as well as your main subject. So this is the order we're going to be going in for this tutorial. Getting rid of your outlines, which leads directly into correct shadow and color intensity, which also leads directly into number 3, background. Let's get to it. So we're automatically starting off in my teaching folder so I can show you some examples of what I was talking about before. First off, let's look at no outlines. This is something I was teaching a student a while ago. These two pictures are extremely similar at this point, and you can see where I was teaching lighting and everything. But this one on the right, this example, which is the drawing itself, has an outline. What would happen if we got rid of the sketch? Well, now you can see that we were relying on the sketch for certain parts, but now it looks a lot more realistic. And look at the background. Even the lighting and the relevance of the background is important, because the background is what's defining this bottom edge, and you can see the reflection over here coming upwards. So this is a very good example of basic initial realism. Let's jump to another one. This hand may be dramatic, but it's starting to have the correct lighting areas. But you can see, again, we're relying on outlines. So what about something that doesn't rely on outlines? What about something that's more flushed in? My student and I were going over brush textures. But one of the reasons that this creepy dog has its edges defined is because there's a bright rim light going along one way. And why does the dog look like it belongs on this blue color? That's because the shadow color itself is a multiplied version of that dark blue. So the dog really fits on its background. Now, what if you just had something sitting on white? This is when you need to start using textures and your other brushes around you. This looks like a giant fur ball, and it looks like it can exist on the white background just by itself. My personal favorite example of realism is something like this. Believe it or not, this picture started out as a sketch. But you can see we don't need any lines, because the darks and the lights are contrasting against each other and defining our edges instead of using the lines themselves. So let's start, and let me show you how to do the basics of this. It will take a long time. This is not an easy process to learn. I want to start with a very basic picture. I took a picture of this highlighter. Now let's shrink it up into the upper corner, just so we have it for reference. First step is starting with our sketch. I'm going to use a greenish tone, like a nice deep dark green, so it's at least a little bit similar to the Sharpie. Now this doesn't have to be an accurate first sketch. We have 2 straight lines coming down this way, and remember, you can make this nice and loose. I'm going to use some of my tools on hand so that I don't have to worry about making everything perfect. I'm going to curve the end since it's going that way in perspective from our eye. And this here is the first part of realism, accuracy to the original thing you're drawing. I'm trying my best to get the proportions correctly to make sure it actually looks like what it did before. This includes the angle of the lines along the Sharpie itself. You can see that this part dips in a bit here, so I'm making that dip in. Got a light line over here, got something going on in there. This dips down over here, a little bit of a bungle, come down, arc that way. It's not even that strong of an arc, come back upwards, and it seems to go all the way up, and then conclude with this line over here. And we can kind of see what's going on in there, so maybe if you want you can gently sketch that in. It's kind of obscure though, it's not very clear. So here we go, we have the basic shape of our Sharpie. Now the next step is adding in color so we can get rid of these outlines. I'm going to put a layer below this. I'm going to choose a nice thick brush. In fact, we can probably just we just really need a fill color right now. So I'm going to see how well I can replicate that color. It's a little bit colder than that, right around there. And start with your base. Don't go to your highlights, don't go to your shadows. Just start off with your base color. Now we're going to fill this in. There's a little bit of that color in here, but again, it's very hidden, but still added in there so you know it's up there. Now, what about this kind of foggy color right here? That's a bit difficult to get in, because if you put this foggy color on a white background, it'd be a lot brighter. It's slightly transparent. Because it's on a dark background, you have to start fooling around with things. Now, in this situation, I would actually jump to doing the background, because now we have the base colors. I'm going to decrease the opacity so I can only see where the sketch is. And now I'm going to jump to my background. In the original picture, the background is a kind of warm toned gray black. So let's put that in just like that right there. First I'm going to drop in this main color. And remember, we're just trying to get the Sharpie to look accurate, so we don't really have to worry too much. And now you can see that the light source in this picture was coming down in the back, and it had a kind of warm orangey tone to it. So I'm going to switch over to that, and I'm going to try using a brush that replicates that texture, just for the sake of accuracy. I'm going to pick up my pen strength as I go to the edges, and continue it behind, because if you look at the picture, it does continue behind the Sharpie. So you have this lighting going on. I'm going to increase the highlight even more. And now we have our color, but it's floating on a random empty plane. What are we going to do about that? Oops, see, we even have some color inaccuracies over here. This is a lot brighter. I'm going to cheat and I'm going to grab that color, and I'm going to put a bit of it in right here, just so we can make sure we know where our light source is coming from. I don't know what this brush is, but it's pushing all the colors all over the place. It's a bit of a bully. Continue it a teeny bit in the back. Now, we can see that the marker is laying on some sort of plane, but we have no way of placing it on the plane. If you were to define this plane, it would probably have something like this as a pattern. And so if you put in a grid in the background, you can now start calculating where your shadow will go. Now look at the original picture for a shadow reference, and now try dopping that in. You need the shadow here because it will make your picture relevant to what plane it's sitting on. If you didn't have a shadow, you wouldn't know where it's sitting. I'm going to follow through in the background. Now let's get rid of these grid lines now since we don't need them. Suddenly, we have a green pen and it's sitting on a background. This feels a lot better than we did in the first few steps. I'm going to soften the edge of this shadow because I know that the material it's sitting on, if you look, it's textured. So just want to kind of pretend that there's a texture there. Let's go back to the actual colors. Now, this is going to be a little bit difficult to grab, but essentially we want a warm white, and we're going to want something with a little bit lower opacity. So I'm going to grab Spectra. I'm going to use my selection tool to make sure these are straight. Curve it down. We got this thing coming down this way. Make sure to curve it like it was in the original picture. Up this way, curve, all the way down. And let's pull it back up. Okay, so we have our basic shape. I know we put the green in there, but we're probably just going to color over the green. Now let's color it in. Just very lightly for our first run, nice and light. Because now that allows some of the background to come through in certain areas. Let's do one more. That's a pretty thick white. Now what? Now I want you to look at what areas are thicker. This thing coming down from the top has a thicker amount, so I'm going to fill that in. Because remember, we want to be accurate to the original picture. We can see that the thickness continues over the edges. So I'm going to grab this and slowly pull it down. Just grab and pull down. And you can see at the bottom, this has a little bit of a higher opacity too. So we can pull down that way. And this here is catching a lot of light too. So we're going to pull it down that way. Now on the inside, there's some darker parts. So I'm going to actually grab this color here because it's very close to those parts. Maybe drop it down, make it a bit greener, since that seems to be the tone inside. And I'm going to gently color that in and try replicating what I see there. Obviously it's getting lighter and lighter, so we pick up our pen pressure. There we go there. And you can see this bright highlight is running along the top, but I don't want you to worry about that until later. Just worry about putting in your darks right now. There's even some going along the edge here, so we can pull that up. Now that black in there is actually pretty dark. So we're gonna gently push it in. Okay. Now what I want you to do, and it's gonna seem a little bit scary, but get rid of your outline. And let's deselect it. This is starting to look decently realistic already. The outline is really only a guide. Remember that. Don't rely on your outline. It's there to show you where you're supposed to be going, but it's not there to be the structure of your picture when you're trying to do realism. The structure of your picture comes from the shading. In fact, I'm going to completely erase my sketch. Bam. Scary. Now I'm going to make a new layer. I'm going to clipping mask it down, and we're going to start working on our shadows. So you can tell, and let's go back to this little layer here. I'm going to clear it. We can see from our reference image that our light source is a kind of bright yellow. And it's coming from this direction. I like drawing lights in because sometimes it just reminds me of where my light source is. So I'm going to do that right here. We have a little bit of a reminder where our light source is. So let's begin with the shadows. The shadow color from our reference image seems to be a very similar tone of green, just darkened a bit, and maybe with a slight blue tone in it. Not too much of a blue tone, but a slight blue tone. Now since we're on a clipping mask, we can literally just color in wherever we want. So the shadow is a very smooth shadow, probably an airbrush. I usually don't use airbrushes, but in this situation an airbrush is warranted. Gently start putting that shadow in. With airbrushes, they can either go too hard or too soft, so make sure to have lots of good hand control here. You can see it snuck over here, so I'm going to take that, I'm going to erase that out of here. And now we have this bright highlight, which has gold to it. I'm going to put this on a new clipping mask layer so we don't mess with our shadows. And I'm going to use the same brush type. Honestly, it looks a little bit like this, but I'm gonna pick this color up just because I don't want to taking too long on showing you guys how to do this. So you can see from the picture that the highlight isn't running along the very top. That would mean that our light source is directly behind the pen, which is not what's happening here. In fact, I'm gonna make this greener and lower it a bit. It's very bright. Our light source is actually running along the top center ridge of the pen like that, since it's a little bit above the Sharpie. So let's use our straighten tool and just let that sit in there. That suddenly made it pop. And if you look, the fact that the light source is coming down in this direction reinforces the fact that the shadow is falling over there. So you have to pay attention. You really, really, really have to pay attention when you're putting your shadows and light sources in, and you have to marry them together and make sure that they reinforce each other, or else they can confuse each other, and nobody really wants that. Let's go back to the lighting though. We have stuff we need to do with the lighting that we didn't do in other places. Now I'm going to create another layer, and this layer will be for details. Now you can see the details on the Sharpie are basically pitch black, so let's make them pitch black. And in this situation, I'm going to grab my line art brush, which is just technical pen, by the way. And we're going to go in and see this black line over here? And then there's the Sharpie highlighter stuff. I'm going to make something different than just Sharpie highlighter, but we actually do want to cop in this black line because it's in the original picture. I'm going to do something a bit daring, and I'm going to take it out of the clipping mask. So we have this black line coming down that is now in the image. And let's write something goofy on here. So we have our weird logo on there, but look how flat it is. And along with the black here, they just don't seem to belong. We are going to give them some highlights. So clipping mask this, and look at the bright color coming down here. I'm just going to pick this up. We're going to grab it. We're going to steal it. And since we're in clipping mask, on a new layer, we can draw right over it. So I think I'm going to jump back into the airbrushing. And remember where our highlight was before? That's the exact same line we're going to run our highlight along. Except right now, it's only affecting these letters, these super shiny letters. And see now, the letters feel like they belong on that pen because it's running alongside with the actual highlights. So making sure that your details also run along with the rest of everything is very important. Okay, what can we do next? What about this black line? Well, that black line, if you look over here, it's carrying a pretty severe highlight. It's a very shiny surface. So I'm actually going to grab my ballpoint, and I'm going along with the highlights that we made before. Just a little square of light right there that extends a tiny bit on that edge. And that's all we need. That's all we need. That looks a lot better now. And you can see there is some grayness, there is some lightness in there. And that lightness is lending itself over. So we are actually going to grab this black, bring it up in the grayscale a little bit, make it a bit warmer. Always remember your light source and what it's doing to everything else. And I am going to add some highlight along here, gently, and down this way, to make it actually seem like the light source is affecting this. And now it is shiny, but it's not shiny enough that can ignore other things. And suddenly, look how much more realistic that looks. So we have a quite realistic looking pen right here, and it's only been a few minutes. What else can we do to make this even more realistic? Well, what about this plastic? We really haven't addressed the plastic at all. Let's jump into our highlights that go on the pen itself, and let's go and rob this color. Let's choose a brush that will work. I like this brush that we're using right now. I think this will be fine. So you can see on the inside, there's some highlights running down. So let's replicate that and give this a little bit of dimension. And you can see the light source beams through and is actually gathering along the bottom. So let's replicate that a bit too. Let it beam through and gather along the bottom. Not too much, just a little bit. And look at this ridge running this way. We really want to make sure that ridge is in there. So let's give it the highlight to allow it to live, and we're going to give it a little bit of a shadow to allow it to live in another way too. Don't worry, we'll get to that. Now, we want to put in this bright, bright highlight running along the top, just along the same area that everything else is happening. Make it gentle as it comes down, and let's push that over to this area too. Let it run along the top. So if you noticed, all I'm really doing is looking at the original picture, figuring out where things are, and figuring out how the highlights and shadows work. Like over here, there's some blue going on in here. We're going to steal that blue. We're going to go to Airbrush, Soft Brush, and I'm gently going to allow that light blue to exist in here. And there's an ever so slight, and I feel like this should be even more realistic. So I'm going to take this dark green that we had going here, and I'm going to drop it down a notch. Because this is at the point where you can start putting in even more detail that wasn't there in the original picture. Just like that. This is called artistic license. Seeing something that you want to stand out more and making it stand out more. This feels a little bit more 3D now with the addition of those two lines. So to review what we did to make this feel more realistic, 1, we got rid of outlines. 2, we put in our background. Then we started putting in our shadows. And then finally, we made sure that the light color was consistent with the light color that was falling upon this pen, so that the background light was married and consistent with the highlight light on our subject. Now, this has only been a few minute drawing. Obviously, we could do more with it, but this is a very good start. My process for this image was extremely similar. You can see I have a ton of layers. I started with my sketch, then I put in my background and my color. If you want to see the speed paint and process I took with this, it's actually on YouTube. But you can see my light source is coming from up here, and it's very, very, very bright and very consistent. It's highlighting over here, over here, over here on his face, and it's all coming from the same direction. You can see that his shadow color is this kind of greenish blue tone, and the reason it's greenish is because it's mixing with his skin tone. But that blue tone comes from the background, so I used the background color to shade him. So this has stylization to it, but it still has realistic lighting sources. All these things for realism come together in the same way. Let's jump over to another piece of art. What about this one? You can see I still have some sketch lines in here, but the reason this looks so realistic is because I took the glow color from Earth and I reflected it onto the back of our space plane. You marry all the different light sources around and make sure that they're on your subject to make sure the picture looks like it belongs all in one piece. For a final image, let's look at something really complicated. This is when you start taking things to extremes. Now, I did this a while ago, but the more complicated prospects of the realism still apply. We have a bright light source coming down this way. It's like a white gold. And the white gold is filling in along the edges of the shadow because it's so bright. It's also reflecting upon this person's staff, upon their arms. And then we have this greenish glow. This greenish glow is the color that's highlighting this person's legs, and even reflecting upwards onto the bottom of her arms. Then we have this super bright white light hitting the ground here, and it's reflecting up onto this surface here. And the whiteness over here is even coming up and hitting the pillars, both there and over here. And everything has a consistent kind of greenish shadow, and you can see that over here, over here, over here. It's going into the hallway. It's behind Queen Elecreu. And in her shadows, it's a bit difficult because she has purple skin, and purple is not known to mix well. But there's still a reflection of this light source on the outside of her arm, and I still used these darker colors to shade her dress, as well as shading the gold accents. And then the bottom over here, this bright light, is reflecting upwards onto her belt. And this shadow color used all around here is in her hair. And again, this bright highlight color is coming and reflecting upon her face. So there are a huge amount of tiny little lighting tricks. Honestly, I would say that the biggest trick for making something look realistic is making sure that you have consistent lighting and that your shadow colors and your lighting colors also go together. That is the most important thing. Because otherwise, this picture would look pretty darn funky. But it doesn't, because I made sure everything was consistent. And what about the most realistic of the realistic? This isn't done, actually. Look, I still have sketchy lines in the background, but the main piece is done. I don't know what the light source is coming here, but there's a consistent blue light source coming this way, and it's hitting upon General Hector's claws. It's hitting upon his face. Then you have the red of his eye over here coming out and reflecting all around on all the different parts of his eye structure. There's a very strong yellow light coming this way, and you can see it's all over them and going along the curves of their body. Queen Elecreu's green eyes and her glowing green soul power are lighting the entirety of both of them. And then you have the bright white eye of the illusionist, of Caracanor, coming over and hitting upon her armor. So again, it's all light sources. Now this is a very complicated light source example because it's coming from so many different directions and it's during the nighttime, so there's nothing bright. But you can still define a figure. Queen Elecreu's figure and General Hector's figure are both quite dark, but I have one light source, two light sources, three light sources, four light sources. And even in the background, this fire could be considered a fifth light source to define his tail. So you can make something look realistic in an unrealistic situation. But this is a very, very, very extreme example of it, and one I haven't even finished yet because it's just so big and complicated. The one annoying thing about having a webcam is I can never get it to concentrate. It's back here. It's back here. Well, I'm just going to have to be fuzzy. So I hope whoever asked the question about realism, I was able to give you a little bit of a look into what I think about when I'm making realistic art. So I showed you the basics of making something realistic on that example with the Sharpie pen or highlighter. And then I showed you how I applied it to my own art. And yes, it does get complicated. Start off slowly. I mean, if you want, jump into a project and be a total badass. But if you want to practice at it, start slowly. Look at objects around you. Start with a very gentle highlight, very gentle sketch, and then fill in your base color, fill in your background, get your shadows down, get your highlights in, and take away that sketch. And actually take away the sketchy lines early in, so you're forced to think about highlight and shadow instead of relying on your outlines. Trust me, I've been through it. I used to rely on outlines. I think I started getting away from outlines at around the age of 16, but that's only when I want to do realistic art. A lot of the time I don't. But that's the trick. Instead of using outlines, Use contrast of light and dark and contrast of color. Look at my face. There's no outlines on my face. There's only the contrasting light and the contrasting color. That's what everything around you is. Differences in shade and color and tone. So try thinking in that way. Next week on Tutorial Tuesday, we will be doing how to draw anatomy. Very basic anatomy lesson. I'll be going over everything I know. It'll be a generalistic kind of lesson like this one was. So, if there's something you want to learn, tell me now in the comments. I will write it down. It'll go on the tutorial schedule. And this Art Talk Thursday, I will be using Ibis Paint for the first time in my artistic career. So, as per usual, drink your water, get your sleep, believe in yourself, and chase your dreams. I'll see you on Thursday. Bye-bye.